Hey guys, today I want to address something that I think has become a pretty major obstacle to people whenever they're trying to understand the doctrines of grace. And that seems to be the proper understanding of what free will is. It's a widely used straw man against the Calvinist position that like predestination turns men into robots, and that suddenly we aren't able to reason or think for ourselves anymore, and that we've been robbed of our free will under what we call the doctrines of grace, the positions of Reformed theology. And so I want to break that down just a little bit and help us understand why that's not actually a problem for the Calvinist, for the Reformed position, more or less. And so I want first and foremost to point out that I think these claims rely on a very false presumption. And that's the presumption that most people will say to you, saying that libertarian free will really is the only way to absolve God from moral responsibility when humans sin. So, take for example this comment thread that I was engaging with on YouTube the other day, with this comment that says, God does not predestine people to sin. It's metaphysically impossible, not to mention blasphemous, to say that God can commit evil. Now, the original comment here is on a video from a Reformed YouTuber. You can see the video description for a link to that video. And check out Reformed pastor clips for some entertaining content I've been enjoying recently. And this video mentions the fact that Judas was predestined to betray Jesus, as the Reformed pastor is sort of anticipating an objection regarding to falling away from the faith. Now, the commentator here takes the phrase predestined to betray Jesus and equates it with God causing Judas to sin. But as I replied, no Reformed theologian would certainly be comfortable with the idea that God forced someone to sin, at least in the way that the commenter implies. And so I commented to him saying, imagine thinking Reformed theologians would be okay saying that God forced anyone to sin. If you hadn't read any Reformed sources on this, then just say so. Because really and truly, the more you read the Reformers, especially the original Reformers, and I think this is very important, and I want to take some time just to address it for a minute. If you read the original Reformers, they're very, very clear on these issues. You can go back and read the creeds and confessions, and you can see how clear they are on discussions of free will and moral responsibility and God's sovereignty. All of those things have very careful distinctions. And unfortunately, in our modern day, it's almost understandable that someone would make a comment like this. Because frankly, too many of us have come across cage stage Calvinists and things like that, to where there's not really a whole lot of knowledge. There's just a lot of fire, a lot of a lot of heat without a whole lot of light. And so we see that happening a lot in the Reformed community, and it's something that I do think needs to be addressed. And it's unfortunate because it leads to straw men being built up, even by the people who claim to hold to those positions that we hold to. And so that's a problem. But I also want to make sure that we understand that the positions that are being argued for are not problematic in the way that people who are taking the opposing side actually think they are problematic in. And so I want to address that a little bit further. Now, his reply here really gives away the farm. He implies that it's not a Calvinistic belief to say that God allows people to sin. Now, I won't even address the rest of the comment, which frankly reveals a pretty rough soteriology, and not even by Reformed standards, just generally speaking. For now, we're going to stick with defending Calvinism, generally speaking. So he says, if you're saying that God simply allowed him to sin, that it's not a Calvinistic belief at all. God does allow evil to happen so he can bring about a greater good. However, God also gives everyone sufficient grace to get to heaven. Like I said, there's some serious problematic issues with that last statement, but we're not going to go down that route right now. The commenter obviously believes, though, that if God is to be considered good and sin still exists, then we have to go back to the definition that I gave earlier, that libertarian free will is the only way to absolve God from moral responsibility when humans sin. What this statement ultimately does, though, is it softens the idea of the sovereignty of God in order to uphold his goodness. Now, I want to affirm that it's good and right to think about God as a good God and to consider so many of the things that we see in this world from the lens of the goodness of God, but we cannot let it soften our doctrine of the sovereignty of God. The presumption is that Calvinism must by necessity soften the idea of the goodness of God in order to uphold his sovereignty. And I promise you that no good Calvinist would ever want to do that. What if I told you that Reformed theology has actually thought through this question before? Believe it or not, in the 500 years of the Reformation, we actually have considered this question from this point of view. There's nothing new under the sun. Reformed theologians have never rejected the concept of free will. In fact, we've written a great deal on the subject, and it's baked into the Reformed confessions like the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Savoy Declaration, and even, of course, the Second London Confession of Faith, the 1689, if you will. And of course, you can see that here in chapter 9. We have an entire chapter on free will, where it reads, God has endued the will of man with that natural liberty and power of acting upon choice, so that it is neither forced nor by any necessity of nature determined to do good or evil. We affirm very clearly that it is not forced by God that we would do good or evil, nor is there any necessity that we would do those things in a determined manner. We understand free will to mean that a moral agent then must make entirely free decisions, but according to his or her nature. We will act freely according to the nature that we've been given. Now, the confession qualifies this freedom of the will, stating that by our fall into sin, we have wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation. And that as those who are dead in sin, we altogether are averse from that good. And this is why we reject the concept of libertarian free will. It's not that men aren't free. No one is putting a gun to my head saying, you need to make this video and sitting me outside here on this beautiful day in order to do it. Rather, it's the nature that I have been given by God that's made me desire to do that very thing. Our natures are bound to freely choose what our natures desire. Let's read from the Second London again in paragraph 3 of chapter 9, where it says, Man, by his fall into a state of sin, has wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation. So we cannot come to salvation on our own because we are not able to will a spiritual good in our natural state. So as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. But this isn't a lack of freedom of the will. When because of the corruption of your nature, you believe that some spiritual evil is your greatest good, you will freely choose that evil. Of course you will. Take the example of Judas once again. We need to come back to what the commenter was getting at to begin with. Judas believed, because of the corruption of his heart, that the 30 pieces of silver were a greater good to him than continuing to follow Jesus. And so he freely chose that evil. And yet we're told by Christ that Judas, bore this title, that he was the son of perdition, even before he had made this free choice. So we need to answer the question that the commenter poses here then. So tell me, how did God predestine Judas to sin? Which I think is easily answered like this. God, according to the good pleasure of his will, elected to pass over Judas, not granting him the gift of faith, and Judas hardened his own heart, as Pharaoh did, toward Christ and the gospel playing out in front of him. What he meant for evil, however, God meant for good, to bring about the salvation of many, which of course is that beautiful quote from Genesis 50:20, which shows that God's plan for the sins of Joseph's brothers was good, though their plan was wicked and evil. And we can say the same thing about Judas. God did not determine or force Judas into the sin. Judas acted according to his nature and according to the greatest good that his nature could discern, not realizing that there was a spiritual good that's far greater, and that would have been that Christ continued on. Of course, God meant for that. God decreed that Jesus would die on the cross, and yet that was brought about by the sinful nature of Judas and his free moral action. It's also a reference to Acts chapter 2 in verse 23, where it says, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you, the Jewish people who Peter was speaking to, have taken by lawless hands, the Romans, have crucified and put to death. The point is, the free actions of moral agents in that scenario, Judas, the Jews, and the Romans, their free choices brought about the death of Christ by the predestined, if you will, plan of God to bring about salvation. So let's return to the fundamental claim of the libertarian, which is that libertarian free will is the only way to absolve God from moral responsibility when humans sin. If libertarian free will doesn't exist in that way, then how do we absolve God from that moral responsibility? Well, we can return to the Second London Confession, where in chapter 3 on God's decree, it speaks in this way in paragraph 1. God hath decreed in himself from all eternity, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably, all things whatsoever come to pass. So we really truly do believe as Reformed theologians that yes, God hath determined all things that come to pass. He has meticulously determined what would happen on this earth. And yet, he does so as thereby as God is neither the author of sin, nor hath fellowship with any therein, nor is violence offered to the will of the creature, nor yet is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So chapter 3 of the Second London describes God's decree. It affirms that God has decreed whatsoever comes to pass, but in such a way that God does not become the author of sin. It also affirms that violence is not done to the free will of the creature. Now, how does that work? Well, the Second London describes it as what's called the liberty or contingency of second causes. This doctrine is related to what we call divine concurrence, which is the idea that two parties can act in the same event to produce an outcome without having the same intent. So the same event, but with a different intent. Because God's providence is designed to bring about our good and his glory, according to Romans 8:28, his decreed action is good, but our free action in accordance with that decree may actually be sinful. The secondary cause, which is us and our intentions, is where the moral responsibility for those actions lies, and therefore God cannot be said to be the author of sin. Now, philosophically speaking, we call this concept compatibilism. The idea is simply that God's sovereignty and human moral responsibility are not in opposition to one another, but rather they're both upheld perfectly. The Bible teaches us this through Judas, through Joseph, and through many other stories within the scriptures. So we don't need to have libertarian free will in order to absolve God from moral responsibility in sinful actions. We just need to affirm what the Bible affirms, that God is sovereign, that man is free, and that these two concepts don't contradict one another. And a word to my Calvinistic friends before this video ends. Stop denying that man has free will. Certainly this straw man continues to exist because it's being perpetuated not only by our opposition, but by many underinformed people on our own side. Uphold free will because it is in fact a gift of God. Just understand and qualify it properly. And hopefully this is the kind of video that will really help people who have struggled with the doctrines of grace because they think it turns us into some kind of automaton that's not able to make choices for ourselves. That's not at all what Reformed theologians have ever claimed. And so we've written many things about this. You can go and read Martin Luther's The Bondage of the Will, followed by Jonathan Edwards' The Freedom of the Will, and these two books that kind of come together to express these truths so perfectly and beautifully. But we see this all throughout church history, and it's a really beautiful doctrine that I think that we should all affirm. Because if we can understand that God is meticulously sovereign over all things, then we can truly grasp the depth of the mercy that God gives to us when he says what he does in Romans 8:28, that he is working all things, every single thing that happens to us according to our good and his glory. And we want to believe that, and we want to affirm it. And I think this is the best way that you can possibly do that. So believe in free will and believe in the sovereignty of God, and be a Calvinist. We like it over here.